Do I even need to say it? Edward is one of my most favorite characters in fiction of all time. In fact, he and Thomas kinda fight each other for the same place in my heart. So after I finished my Gauge 1 Thomas, I decided it was time to start work on Edward. Well, before I even thought of working on Edward, there was just one itty-bitty problem. The model locomotive that Awdry uses to depict Edward on his 00 gauge layout is a completely different class. The locomotive that Edward is in canon is a Furness Railway K2, albeit with some modifications, most notably the Northeastern Railway styled cab. Awdry's model is straight up a 2P, which there are many differences between it and the illustrations that I do not like. So after a failed attempt of a TV series accurate Edward, which I would eventually turn into scrap dressing, I decided to go on a Fusion 360 and make a Furness K2 body. I did make a separate body to resemble Edward's cab from both the books and the TV series. Confident with the parts, I went and started prototyping my Edward. Sadly, this was all I got for the time being. The 3D printer I had since day one gave out on me as its extruder mechanism failed. I was able to get some parts to repair it, but it wasn't repaired completely. So I was without a 3D printer for quite some time. Until Elegoo was having a sale on their Neptune 3 Max series, and I had to get one of those. I wasted no time at all getting onto their website and placing my order. I wanted Edward. I wasted no time at all getting this behemoth set up. I gradually got the parts I needed and came closer and closer to completing Edward. Upon putting Edward together, I decided to put him on some track and test him on some curves. He had a tendency to derail until I modified his front bogie with more pivot space. Edward runs along curves much more easily now. Next, I gave Edward some lining, done exactly the same way as I did for Thomas. Upon test running Edward again, the crank pins would constantly hit the tops of the running board, snapping his side rods. Plus, they looked like crap anyway, so I decided to ditch those and make Edward some new ones. I also decided to redo Edward's chassis to be more narrow to accommodate some washers. That way we can reduce friction between the drive wheels and the chassis. And it worked! Hey, here's a little tip. When designing your own locomotives for G-scale, the back-to-back gauge is 1.589. If your locomotives are correctly gauged to that, it will definitely ensure far smoother running and no derailments around curves. Next, it was time for the tender. I wanted to go with the classic tender that the K2s already used. I really do not like those Fowler tenders. You know, for someone who says the illustrations are inaccurate and not to be taken seriously, it does confuse me why he went so hard to justify how they look. Seriously there, Awdry. What in the actual heck were you thinking here, buddy? Again, lining was done the exact same way as I did for Thomas, but I gave Edward a LMS-styled number 2. Picked out the buffer heads on both the front and the rear, and painted Edward's rear buffer beam red, just like in the model series. I also went ahead and fitted some metal wheels onto Edward's tender, as I really didn't want to fit plastic ones on. These are literally just spare Bachmann metal wheels that you can literally go onto Amazon and buy. And for the cherry on the cake, I put immersive coal in Edward's tender. Now back to Edward, I decided to go ahead and airbrush his cab roof black, and then printed out his whistle, safety valve, and reverser rod. Really starting to bring our old reliable chap to life now. While editing this video, I decided to paint the top of Edward's funnel in a copper paint, just like what Awdry's model had, and I really like it. Old-fashioned engines just really know how to rock that look. And Edward is done. Now I know there will be people who will call me out on some inaccuracies they will find on Edward, and honestly, that's kind of the fun part for me. I love to take constructive criticism to give myself a fun little challenge to see how I can improve my work. Speaking of, I kind of want to challenge myself to see if I can fit some cab detail in Edward. What do you guys think? Edward was just so fun to make, both because he's basically one of my most favorite characters ever, and the ever unfolding events that occurred while making Edward. I think my most favorite parts of Edward have to be his copper chimney cap, his safety valve and whistle, and all the other separately painted details in gray that I've picked out all across Edward. I'll still be holding on to my old 3D printer as I'm still gonna need it to help me make stuff to sell, and the big new one's especially gonna help a lot. I'll see to motorizing my models eventually, maybe pick up some Pico G-scale wheels to help with that, but for now, I think that's gonna wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Oh, wait a second. I never explained to you why Edward had a knuckle coupler. On the way home, however, the weather changed. Wind and rain buffeted Edward. His sanding gear failed, and his firemen rode in front, dropping sand on the rails. Come on, come on. This is dreadful. Suddenly, with a shrieking crack, something broke and Edward painfully slowed to a stop. The passengers all gathered around while the crew inspected the damage. "One of your crank pins broke, Edward," said the driver at last. "We've taken your side rods off. Now you're a single, like an old-fashioned engine. Can you get these people home, Edward? They must get back tonight." "I'll try, sir," promised Edward. So with every ounce of steam Edward had left, he slowly started to move the train. "Come on," panted Edward. With every wheel slip, Edward started to move the first coach. The first coach helped start the second, and so on down the train. "I've done it! I've done it!" shouted Edward. "Steady, boy, steady," warned his driver. "You've got him! You've got him!" A roar of passengers cheered as Edward struggled on. The Fat Controller anxiously paced the platform, with the special train waiting. With a distant beep beep, battered, weary, but unbeaten, Edward steamed in. The Fat Controller angrily stepped forward. He pointed to the clock, but excited passengers swept him aside as they cheered on Edward and his crew before rushing off to their train. Thank you guys so much for watching. This video was a ton of fun to work on. All credit for the music used in this video goes to the wonderful efforts of these souls. Now, I'm going to be doing the rest of the characters, not in numerical order, but from most voted to least voted on my polls. Now, since this was a lot of work, it would really help me a lot if you guys left a like on this video. Thank you guys so much for your support, and please feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. But for now though guys, I think this is gonna wrap it up. So I see you guys next time on my next video. Okay, peace out guys. Bye. Thank you.